Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Jonathan Duprat.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we are here with a good friend of ours, Austin. Austin, welcome aboard.
Hello. Thank you all for having me on. Just to give a brief little background about me, my name is Austin. I am an open source intelligence analyst, and I currently operate as a senior risk consultant in the private intelligence space.
Well, Austin, we love having you on board for the second segment of a series of the Bluff podcast that we call the Cartel Corners. The first one we had really talked about the situation in Mexico and the Mexican cartels. But I think a lot of people need to understand that the violence of, and threat of organized crime and gangs is much more widespread than just in Mexico. And I think you're a great host and guest to have on board to kind of speak about this. This is an area that you and I have spoken a lot in the background. You have a lot of expertise in a lot of regions in South America, specifically, El Salvador and Haiti. So we obviously, with Trump now president, part of his executive orders that he signs, one of the key ones was the designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. But there was two other groups that they mentioned that they wanted to designate as foreign terrorist organizations, specifically Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan prison gang that is really spread over in the Western Hemisphere, and MS-13, which, I think a lot more Americans are very familiar with, that, is a LA-based gang that really took a lot of hold in El Salvador until recently. So, Austin, I'll start this conversation by asking you a question. MS-13 has lost a lot of power within the last couple of years. They're not where they used to be. What do you associate that drop in power, and do you think measures by the El Salvadorian government had an effect on that?
Yeah, so what's interesting about MS-13, or as they're known locally, Mara Salvatrucha, is that they're a cartel or organized crime group that has general name recognition across the U.S. political space. Often when cartels are discussed, they're kind of discussed in a vague sense of the cartels. In some cases, you'll see individual groups break out of that designation. We saw it previously with the Sinaloa cartel. In Mexico, we saw it also previously with Los Zetas, as you remember, and MS-13 has sort of reached that threshold as of, I want to say, about 10 years ago, right? So the situation, MS-13 and their former rival, currently in a ceasefire with them, other group, Barrio 18 or Barrio 18, is that they're in a ceasefire, again, between those two. And a large portion of them have been arrested by the Bukele government. Also interesting to note that, as you noted, MS-13, unlike other organized crime groups in Haiti or in El Salvador or in Mexico, started in the United States as a prison gang, mostly in the Los Angeles area or the American Southwest, and were later sort of exported back to El Salvador, where they set up shop and were able to kind of run the show in many parts of the country, most of all in San Salvador. This continued for quite some time, to the point where they essentially held a monopoly or oligopoly on violence in various parts of San Salvador. And their method for negotiating with the prior administration was, whenever they didn't get their way, and we'll get to what that means in a moment here, whenever they didn't get their way, they were able to essentially start murdering people. That was their way to leverage negotiations with the government, was to up the amounts of homicides in San Salvador, as well as set up various extortion rackets, to the point where in the previous administration, if you were traveling from point A to point B in San Salvador, you could reasonably expect to pass through multiple borders between MS-13, Barrio 18, and some other smaller groups. And at each border, it wouldn't matter if you were a police officer, a bus driver, or just a normal citizen, you would be expected to pay a toll to go from sort of border to border there. That has since changed after Bukele initiated his deployment of the El Salvadorian military, has initiated this mass arrest campaign, which, while being effective at arresting members of MS-13 and Barrio 18, has also included the widespread arrest of individuals who may not be involved with either group or even smaller groups. Um, and equally so, has some evidence come to light that negotiations, the same strategy that occurred in the prior administration between the gangs and the government, or as they call the gangs in El Salvador, the Maras, are still ongoing. So Bukele's strategy was to take an institution of his country that was mostly untouched by the Maras, and one of the only ones that was, and that would be the military, and utilize that to directly combat their operations and disrupt their operations on a day-to-day basis, while also pressing along the negotiation front to get their leaders in line using similar strategies that, while evidence for that hasn't been extremely forthcoming, and will be unlikely to be with the incoming American administration, probably follows similar lines of negotiation we've seen between the El Salvadorian government and the Maras in previous instances of that. That being said, the result is we're looking at MS-13 as an organization that previously had the operational capacity to conduct its own form of business in the United States previously, and now, in my opinion, no longer has the capability to do so.
So I guess the question then becomes, because it's kind of like this carrot and stick approach that Bukele leverage, kind of summarizing in layman terms how you described it, right? The stick was this mass arrest campaign that, as you mentioned, probably included, segments of the Salvadorian population that had nothing to do with gang, but induced, tens of thousands of arrests, and obviously a large segment of those were probably related to gangs leveraging the military, an institution that really wasn't penetrated by El Salvadorian gangs. So that being the stick. But then you're mentioning this carrot approach, where Bukele, had a lot of negotiations with leadership of both, 18th Street Gang and MS-13, that even the Biden administration, they sanction top officials of the Bukele administration for, providing protection to MS-13 and kind of involving themselves in corrupt practices to make sure that the leadership of MS-13 and other gangs kind of followed and towed the line of dropping violence. And so I guess my question for you is, what do you think of both approaches, the carrot and stick, was more effective, or it had to be a combination of both to see the results that we're seeing in El Salvador?
The answer up front, or the bottom line up front, if I should say, is that the introduction of the stick and the combination of that to what previously was almost entirely a carrot alone approach is what's kind of seen the results that we're looking at today. So the administration prior to Bukele, as well as Bukele, and this comes from sort of some of the evidence brought forth by the United States Treasury Department, who has been investigating Bukele's negotiations and his various administrators' negotiations with the Maras, has indicated that the carrot side of things has mostly been conversations between officials and leadership with the Maras to, here's what we can give you in exchange for playing ball. Now, this has involved anything as large as giving them real estate along the Salvadorian coast, areas that are, probably have and are going to continue to appreciate in value as the overall crime rate has gone down. And that can go as small as there was one case where there was a murder spree ongoing in San Salvador because the Maras were angry about their conditions in prison. And the carrot in that case was literally shipping buckets of chicken wings into the Salvadorian jails because that's what they wanted. And so that carrot approach can be on a very wide scale between units of value that only impact leadership and units of value that affect the rank and file who are currently locked up and in prison. Now, the stick side of things, and this is something the previous administration didn't really have the will or the means to do, is the introduction of the military into daily peacekeeping or policing operations in the country itself. As I kind of laid out The military itself has mostly been separated from the Maras. There have been some recruitment tactics that we've seen echoed in other countries like Mexico, where individuals who are related to victims of crime by the Maras have been specifically recruited, as they tend to be slightly less corruptible due to due to that previous personal history. So the introduction of that stick element is, instead of the negotiation being, here, have this, please play ball, it's, you're going to play ball, or we're going to hit you with more mass arrests, we're going to hit you with more crackdowns. But again, remember, we're still willing to kind of play ball here. So that's why I think it's been found to be more effective. I think the stick is that we've seen arrests go ridiculously up to a ridiculous level. So the stick is very there. But the negotiations are pretty clearly still ongoing between Bukele, his administrators, and the leaders of the Maras.
And I think one specific example recently, within the last couple of years, was an interesting case where actually in Mexico, an MS-13 leader was detained, and it kind of raised eyebrows because this MS-13 leader, El Salvador claimed, was in prison. He was publicly, by the El Salvadorian government, said he was in prison. The Mexican government detained him. And the irony of the situation was there was an extradition battle between the United States and El Salvador to extradite this MS-13 leader to either or country. And the thought process was, well, clearly, if El Salvador claimed he was in prison, but he was in Mexico, and they want to extradite him back, is to provide that level of protection that if he arrived in the United States, he would no longer receive. And I think, that's kind of an interesting contrast. But I do agree, the utilization of the military, and we have seen even recently, last week, the El Salvador Navy, for example, seized, I think, close to 2 tons of cocaine off of international waters. And so that kind of demonstrates that El Salvador, unlike in other countries around the world that have tried to employ the military as a stick to reduce gang violence and the monopoly of violence in the country, the threat that they have, the El Salvadoran government probably found this, Goldilocks of carrot and stick to find the right approach, because the results are clear. Violence, El Salvador used to be the homicide country of the world. And now, homicides have drastically reduced, enabling, as you said, tourism to even come back into the country.
Yeah, I would agree. However, I would also make, in my opinion, a very important note that I believe El Salvador was equally willing to suspend many judicial rights for its own people in these mass arrest campaigns. And the anecdote that comes to mind is, so there were, Bukele is incredibly popular amongst South American voting populaces to this day. Like, polls for him in other countries that are experiencing issues with organized crime, be it Colombia, be it Ecuador, or be it Mexico, are quite high, which I think is very indicative that, individuals who are experiencing the effects of organized crime on a day-to-day basis generally don't like it, unless they're either on the take or personally involved themselves. And so the anecdote that comes to mind was there was this supporter of Bukele from Colombia who went to go visit San Salvador to show his support. However, he was covered in tattoos, for just personal tattoos, right? Now, the important thing to note here is that many members of the Maras, be it Mara Salvatrucha or Barrio 18, tend to use tattoos as an identifying symbol. So this man arrived in San Salvador and decided to go to the presidential palace to show his support, and was caught up in a mass arrest campaign and arrested because he had tattoos. I don't know if he's gotten released at this point, but I think that's a really good kind of anecdote to show how, when the military decides to roll in and conduct these mass arrest operations, they do just catch people who aren't involved. And so in the process of getting all of these gang members in prison, you're also getting a portion of your population who just happens to be, or in this case, part of Colombia's population who happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, there have been some cases where these individuals have been released, and that's been sort of widely covered by the Salvadorian media. However, indicators show that those are the exceptions rather than the rule. And I think anybody following El Salvador will also agree that there has been a certain amount of judicial and media independence that has been lost during the crackdowns as well.
So I have a quick question for you regarding MS-13. Um, I've seen some analysis that part of this declining homicide rate might also be tied to changing of criminal tactics that they're utilizing. Perhaps they're getting more sophisticated, looking at a big picture, and we're not seeing as much of the localized violence that we've seen in the past, or maybe the crackdown has applied pressure that has forced these changes. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I definitely would say that the crackdown has forced some change. If you look at if you honestly just look at traffic patterns alone, if we want to get into kind of an OSINT perspective here, traffic patterns alone in San Salvador have changed drastically. You used to be able to see traffic jams being caused by Mara checkpoints as individuals were kind of forced to pay their tolls going from border to border of each group. You don't really see that as much. And I think the reason for that is the crackdowns have led to a partial disintegration of territorial control in the capital itself. And I know we're going to get to Haiti, and we'll talk about, what does that mean, having essentially control of a part of a city and maintaining those borders. But previously, San Salvador operated very similarly to Port-au-Prince, where you would have these borders. They would be rigorously enforced by the gangs themselves. And with a lot of those gang members now sitting in jail, they don't really have the same capacity to carry out what previously I described was their negotiation tactic, which was murdering people. And so when you lose this localized control, especially in the capital, you lose the capability to wage sort of wanton violence at will. And also, you lose the press attention that comes with that because it's no longer happening in the capital. It may be happening towards the periphery of the country, if at all. That being said, we haven't really, since Bukele started the crackdowns, we haven't really seen anything that came near to some of the murder sprees that were going on when he first came into office or prior to that. The negotiating tactic has clearly changed.
Yeah, I think you bring up a interesting point with the tolls and the taxes that some of these organizations levy. We see it also with terrorist groups in Africa, in the Sahel, the Middle East, and I think a lot of people overlook that aspect of the funding. But to quickly follow up on that, I was wondering if maybe you could juxtapose the crackdown that we've seen in El Salvador that has led to success versus the crackdown that was promised in Honduras, and why you think the situation in Honduras has not seen the improvements that we've seen in El Salvador. Um, you know, things like corruption, I've heard discussed the difference between the groups, but you seem like the perfect person to ask to shed some light on that.
Yeah, I think it kind of drums down to, and I'll preface this by saying I am not an expert on Honduras. However, what I will say is that Honduras and Guatemala equally have been dealing with large-scale corruption issues over the last couple of decades. And so my guess here, my educated guess, would be that Honduras is dealing with the political reality that their own people may not have the want for the level of, in my opinion, authoritarian measures necessary to execute a full military campaign inside of their own country. And I think that's something that gets passed over a lot with El Salvador. I think often we kind of just talk about the results. We talk about how, the homicide rate is down. We talk about how the Maras no longer have majority control of the capital. We talk about how, the murder sprees have ended. But what's been kind of sacrificed to get to that point has been a gutting of the judiciary in the country. It's been a gutting of the independent media in that country. And it's been these mass arrest campaigns, which, as I've said before and I'll say again, has involved the arrest of innocent individuals at a certain point. So my guess on the Honduran government is that there are probably some individuals within those institutions who are like, we think the sacrifice of these institutions is larger than a potentially temporary bump in the crime numbers, right? Or in the negative direction. Um, as well as the fact that voters in Honduras may value their independent media or their judicial system more than they would like to see, armored cars rolling down their street.
And that might be borne out as well when you look at the security forces. El Salvador was able to significantly increase and leverage those. When President Castro came into power in Honduras, he had promised to increase the police force by about 50%. Um, but since 2022, there's been a slight decline in the actual number of people working the security forces. So wouldn't surprise me if that's a factor. And like you were saying with corruption, his predecessor, Castro's predecessor, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was convicted in 2024 in the United States.
Mhm.
So I think that makes it pretty clear that there is a level of corruption there. So yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that.
By all means.
So with that, Austin, you mentioned earlier Haiti, and I think that's a very important kind of not only situation, obviously, and how it might impact, the Western Hemisphere, but it kind of highlights something that we've talked a lot before, and it's this kind of this new development where now we have countries, and this is kind of a Western Hemisphere problem set for now that has the potential to be replicated in other continents, but where gangs, organized crime, and cartels are actually leading to state failure, right? And I think Haiti is that perfect example where I think most people understand, mafias, gangs, and all that can cause state decay, increased level of violence, corruption, but generally kind of the institution, but either at the local, state, or federal level, depending on what country you're analyzing, generally kind of stays intact in most areas, even when gangs might control significant amount of territory. Kind of the nation state in itself is not really threatened. But Haiti is different. We basically have seen a complete breakdown in law and order of Haiti, where the state is basically holding itself by a thread because of gangs that are not motivated necessarily, at least at face value at the beginning, by a political ideology. They might have interest in political power, but clearly it's for more economic means. And Matthew mentioned this in a previous space, this greed versus grievance, where we generally see grievance leading to state failures. Haiti shows that greed can do it as well. And so I'd like this opportunity for you to kind of give an explanation of, the latest developments in Haiti and how we got here and the different gangs involved. But more importantly, if you can, also explaining this and highlighting the absolute chaos that these gangs have wrought onto Haiti.
Yeah. So I think it's good to kind of start from the American perspective here and then compare and contrast the situations in Haiti and El Salvador to kind of build context. So, why it's important to mention Haiti is that recently, via executive order, MS-13 was designated as an FTO or a foreign terrorist organization, right? Which is interesting because, as we've kind of laid out, MS-13 is mostly pacified at this point. They're either being negotiated with or in jails. They're no longer really carrying out day-to-day operations anywhere near the scale that we've seen previously, either in the United States or in El Salvador. Now, the primary gang in Haiti that's been getting all the press is the G9 group that has since merged as of February of last year into a larger coalition called Vive Ensemble. And that is led by The one guy that has done something that's very rare in Haiti, and it's gotten Western media attention, Barbecue Cherizier, Jimmy Cherizier. Um, Now, that group has not been designated as an FTO, even though they have explicitly come out and said previously over the last year that they are looking to seek sort of political control in Haiti. So they're carrying out violence not just for greed, but there is sort of a political goal there as well. Now, El Salvador, as we pointed out, does have a standing army, and that army has been utilized to effectuate this mass arrest campaign, the mass security operations, everything like that. Haiti does not have an army. Haiti has Haiti's only domestic enforcement mechanism beyond its judiciary, but as we all know, the judiciary itself is not going out and enforcing, is the Haitian National Police. And the Haitian National Police is, in my opinion, and feel free to disagree with me, more of a paramilitary organization in the way that they're armed, the way that they conduct themselves. And due to the large amount of gun crime that occurs in Haiti, they kind of have to be. They're not rolling around in squad cars for the most part. They mostly have to roll in armored vehicles, of which most are in desperate need of repairs. So El Salvador has a military, Haiti does not. El Salvador has a president and has political leadership there. Haiti has been trying to figure out its own political leadership ever since the assassination of Jovenel Moïse by Colombian nationals, not Colombian government legitimized mercenaries. And so in Haiti, you have the issue where you're trying to deal with a problem that's of the same size, relatively, that MS-13 was in San Salvador, but you don't have the same institutions to pull on. You don't have a military you can deploy into the streets, and you don't have a stable civil government to legitimize that deployment. So the issue that we're running into in Haiti is that Vivan Sam and the other gangs in Port-au-Prince are kind of running around willy-nilly, and the Haitian National Police and now the recently deployed multinational security, it's MSS, I believe. Yeah, Multinational Security Support Mission, which was legitimized by UN SC Resolution 2699, is trying to play whack-a-mole with them. They're setting up forward operating bases throughout the city, but at the same time, it's very hard to stamp out organized crime if there isn't a legitimate government solution also working in the background. If you're not giving a legitimate way to conduct business and ensuring safety for business or individuals to kind of go about their daily lives, it's very hard to get them to turn away or start to stop fearing organized crime, criminal reprisals. So what has this led to in Haiti? This has led to issues with imports and exports. We've seen the primary port in Port-au-Prince come under gang control multiple times, in which, much like how the Mars in El Salvador would enforce extortion rackets or not tariffs. Good Lord, I don't know why I said tariffs. Tolls on going in and out. You do see Haitian gangs extorting tolls out of people importing stuff to Haiti, people trying to export stuff out of Haiti, or individuals just managing to pass by the port for whatever reason. We've seen cases of where the international airport in Port-au-Prince, Toussaint-Louverture, has been shut down multiple times because gangs have shot at commercial airliners. And so the way that Haitian gangs are able to exert political leverage is by upping not only the violence within Haiti, but threatening international either corporations, companies, travelers, NGOs with violence should they not decide to play ball with the various gangs.
So and because I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, a couple of days ago, the U.S. Embassy, there was a vehicle that had U.S. Embassy personnel in Haiti that was attacked. It's not the first time that's happened, where violence has, been very near to the U.S. Embassy. But, one of the aspects of the Haitian National Police that you mentioned, and it's important to highlight that when we discuss about, for example, one of the cartel corners is, rough estimates is about 70% of the weapons that Mexican cartels use that have been seized by the Mexican government can be traced back directly to the United States, from U.S. gun manufacturers. The vast majority of them smuggled into Mexico by private citizens, and kind of this weapon smuggling infrastructure that exists in the United States that really arms these Mexican cartels. It looks like in Haiti, they're running into the same issue where a couple of years ago, I believe it was either last year or 2 years ago, the organization, the regional organization that represents the Caribbean, CARICOM, they basically released a statement demanding the United States to intervene in this weapon smuggling network. That in Haiti specifically, it looks like the gangs are able to leverage effectively to basically outgun and overpower the Haitian National Police. That even to the point that Kenya has deployed, I believe, 600 military personnel, police personnel to the country to serve kind of this UN-backed mandate peacekeeping mission. And actually the Kenyans in Haiti is probably one of the rare examples where they're operating more on the offense, kind of outside the traditional world peacekeeping forces, where they're there to maintain the peace and try to prevent violence from affecting the civilian population. Here, the Kenyans have a clear mandate to target the gangs. They have targeted the gangs, but these gangs are receiving weapons from U.S. weapons smuggling networks. And so, the question I have for you is kind of two-tier. The first one, kind of this U.S. weapon smuggling into Haiti and the effects it's having on the Haitian population. And then two, kind of what is your impression of the Kenyan, peacekeeping force and how effective they are?
Yeah, so starting with the United States and sort of the gun issue, right? I think it's important for listeners to understand that the illicit supply network between illegitimate groups or non-state actors in Latin America in general, but also in the case of Haiti, involves that the United States is a consumer of drugs and other illicit goods, and that's where the money goes there, right? The U.S. is an exporter of illicit weaponry. Now, none of this is obviously being, conducted by the United States government, except in I believe the one case during Fast and Furious where we attempted to trace these guns and we ended up accidentally giving them to um, non-state cartel groups. But that's the supply network, right? In Haiti, there are multiple, in the interior of the country, there are multiple illegitimate airstrips that operate as sort of smuggling areas for drugs to go into the United States. And equally, that's an area where guns go into the country. The U.S. has a comparative advantage, if we want to talk, basic macroeconomic terms here, in the production of firearms due to the large size of our civilian firearms market, whereas Haiti can operate as a transport hub for illegitimate drugs. And so drugs go out of Haiti, they go into the United States. Guns come out of the United States, they go into Haiti. What does this mean? This means that Haitian groups, Haitian gangs, have been able to access and continue to be able to access U.S. consumer firearms. And the result of that is you have Haitian gangs who already outnumber the Haitian National Police being able to equally outgun them in certain engagements. Now, that was a major reason why there's been so much international focus on this new security support mission, which, as Stefano pointed out, is operating differently than other UNSC peacekeeping forces. I think a good modern day comparison here is if you look at UNSC missions in Sudan, those are mostly prioritized on defending groups of people at risk or preserving humanitarian supply lines there. Whereas the UNSC mission in Haiti is operating in a semi-offensive capacity where you do have Kenyan peacekeepers deploying to areas to try and take territory and set up these, they're calling them forward operating bases. I think a better comparison would be a fortified police station in a lot of cases. But as Stefano pointed out, they're operating at around 600 personnel right now. It's not just from Kenya. There are also individuals from Jamaica, Guatemala, El Salvador, um, Belize, and I think the Bahamas. I think that's the current contingent right now. So it's around 600 people, and they are conducting these offensive operations, and they actually have found some success. The biggest issue with them early on was that it took Kenya about a year to actually start deploying these individuals into Haiti, and a major reason for that was, as I kind of pointed out, the international airport in Port-au-Prince gets shut down pretty often. And if there aren't commercial flights going in, the Kenyans had the option to kind of deploy with, I believe they operate 2 to 3 C-130s, but trying to take a contested airport out of the back of a C-130 is a pretty tall task, especially if you're not being offered, air support from the United States or something of that nature. And if you do that, if you do run a contested air landing, you run the risk of large scale collateral damage. So I think the Kenyans were waiting for a time when they could ensure that this force could be safely deployed and set up operations before, starting off at combat off the jump, but also ensuring that they could set up logistic lines to them so they could continue operating.
I think the
So,
closest example we can probably look at from UNSC missions of offensive operations where peacekeepers are involved in offensive operations, I think, is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, kind of the North Kivu region in the northeast that borders Rwanda. There's a specific mission within the overall UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC that authorized offensive operations that was led by South Africa.
Mm.
I think there was other. I think there was Malawi, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was Tanzania that had contingents of actually their special forces engaged in offensive operations against the M23 Rwandan-backed rebels. Besides that, I mean, Haiti is the other example. But you know, Austin, I mean, we talked about Haiti. We talked about El Salvador, and I think we can literally have a podcast in almost every country in the Western Hemisphere of gangs, cartels, organized crimes really threatened. I mean, Ecuador, for example, it was a perfect example. Last year, where gangs really brought the country almost to a standstill with increased level violence. Was historically years of increased violence that really exploded at that time because of gangs in Ecuador. That a lot of them were actually being supported by actually Mexican cartels, exporting, the Mexican cartel violence almost into other countries, specifically into Ecuador. That country, we can look at Brazil and the rise of these Brazilian gangs, specifically in Rio de Janeiro, and the violence they caused there. You can look at Jamaica. I mean, Peru, etc. All these countries. But I'd like to end this podcast on one specific country because of the latest developments that happened, and the related to Colombia, because a recent episode we did was kind of talking about Venezuela and the Maduro regime, and we briefly touched upon kind of the groups operating there, like Trinidad and how they spread into South America, and the FTO designation for them and the violence they wrought around there. But in Colombia specifically, I mean, we're seeing recent violence between the ELN and a specific FARC dissident group that's really caused a lot of problems for Colombia. And I'd like your kind of reaction because the Colombian president was recently actually in Haiti, and now he has this violence kind of rising in his own country again. And let's not forget that Colombia is not is very it's very common in Colombian history, the civil wars with the FARC dissidents and the ELN. So they have a long history of wars with communist guerrillas, autodefensa, cartels, gangs. But this violence now specifically seems to be a serious concern for the current Colombian government.
Yeah, so you brought up one point that I wanted to touch on Haiti real quick before we jump to Colombia here, because you're correct that the foreign minister was recently, or the former foreign minister was recently in Haiti. I believe Petro was as well. And that's the fact that, through all these security missions, through the fact that the Haitian National Police has gotten some support, and now we have the UNSC forces on the ground there, Haiti still hasn't picked a president. And so I think when we talk about Haiti, we have to realize that we can continue to throw arms and warm bodies towards a security solution there, but if there isn't a civil solution attached to that, there isn't really a future being offered. What's being offered is potentially a ceasefire, but if there's no alternative. So as of right now, Haiti still has a presidential transition council, is what they're called. The head of that is Leslie Voltaire. Um, but the Presidential Transition Council over the last, I believe it's been a year and a half now, has not been able to pick a sitting president that's stuck. And so until Haiti is able to do that, and I believe after the assassination of Moise and the rise of now former President Ariel Henry, we also had the Haitian legislature walk out. They all resigned. And so we're looking at a country that doesn't have a legislature, has some semblance of a judiciary, but again, oftentimes the jails are being sacked by gangs and everyone gets let out. So there's not much of a consequence to arrest, um, beyond, I guess, the equivalent of a timeout. Uh, and then doesn't have a legitimized sitting president. It has the head of a presidential transition council whose mandate is essentially to elect a president, and they haven't. And so Haiti's going to continue to really struggle, even if the UNSC forces continue to gain ground. They're going to struggle with what do you replace once the FOBs get drawn down? What happens then? Do the gangs
And
just roll right back in, or is there an actual legitimate government at that time?
And just to add on onto that, I do think the security aspect is very important to give them the space to conduct something like an election.
For sure.
But that needs to be done in concert. One last thing before we pivot to Colombia that I think is worth pointing out and something to keep an eye on. The Salvadorian Air Force recently, just this month, sent, I think, 8 or 10 officers, airmen, to Haiti. So we should see what type of operations, if any, they'll be involved in, and if that is indication that we're going to continue to see this mission expand.
Yeah, my speculation on that would be, so obviously there's been a ton of interest in El Salvador by its neighbors and by other countries in the region towards how they've conducted security operations because the results are there, right? Um, my speculation would be with these individuals specifically coming from the Air Force that I do think it is a priority to secure Toussaint Louverture International Airport in Port-au-Prince, keeping that line of supply open and safe, I think is a primary priority for both the Presidential Transition Council as well as the peacekeeping mission, because the less tolls you have to pay to gain checkpoints, the better, right? And if you can ensure the safety of that airport, you can maintain that commercial flights into the country aren't being interrupted as often as they currently are. But on that, pivoting to Colombia, where we are once again dealing with the ELN, who in Colombia's case, and feel free to disagree with me if you do, in the case of the ELN or FARC, right, in difference to MS-13 or the G9 group or Barrio 18, where these are all organized criminal enterprises that have reached a point of influence that they can now engage in politics. The ELN and FARC started as explicitly political organizations in both cases on the communist side of things, who are now engaging in criminal enterprises to maintain themselves, maintain sort of funding, arms, things like that in pursuit of what's stated as their political goals. But, in some cases, a lot of these subgroups have just kind of devolved into organized criminal groups first, with the veneer of a political organization above that. In FARC's case, over the last 10 years, we've seen a ton of progress on two fronts. Number one, open negotiations with the largest elements of them leading to a ceasefire and their eventual incorporation into the Colombian government. We've also seen a really positive, I guess the proper term would be like lack of a recidivism rate, where a lot of former FARC members have been successfully integrated back into Colombian society. Whereas the ELN has opted, really not to engage in large scale negotiations leading to ceasefires that are anything but temporary with the Colombian government, even under Petro. Every negotiation we've seen between them and the Colombian government has not been towards integration in a political future. It's been for we're going to have a ceasefire for this amount of days in exchange for A, B, and C, right? What's changing now is it appears that the Petro government is very interested in conducting more security operations in the eastern part of the country, so those jungles by the Venezuelan border, to the point where Petro himself is appearing in front of maps that show exactly where the Colombian military is moving, quite comically, in my opinion. But yeah, that's where I think I'd start on Colombia.
I mean, it's an interesting development when analyzing, the FARC dissidents and the ELN and the kind of the dynamics of that, because the violence there is not only in Colombia, we've seen it in Venezuela. There was even reports of, certain, the Sinaloa cartel and even CJNG having presence and almost, supporting various sides of that internal conflict. But we do see that these kind of FARC dissidents and ELN violence kind of spreads and impacts both Colombia and Venezuela. But it's a key point that you bring up that these groups started as political actors, and for all intents and purposes, are drug trafficking organizations, right? Mm-hmm. Very similar to maybe in another example, is probably like the Shining Path in Peru, that started out as this, kind of this communist Maoist insurgent group that now has been, for all intents and purposes, again, a drug trafficking organization. So going back to Colombia, though, the dynamics of that conflict does appear to have a significant impact in the Colombian government's ability to, as Petro's trying to do and achieve, is total peace. Because this isn't a situation where this latest round of violence is not between, historically, the FARC against the Colombian government or the ELN against the Colombian government. It's two different terrorist groups, as recognized by the United States, foreign terrorist organizations, fighting each other, causing widespread destruction, and forcing the Colombian government either to try to act as a peacekeeping force or, target one side. And even it looks like Petro's now taken a very hard line stance specifically against the ELN. But that's another dynamic that I think kind of gets overlooked when analyzing South America. And we could just focus this here specifically on Colombia, where in many cases, the governments have to act almost as peacekeepers between rival gangs or cartels or drug trafficking organizations battling each other out. And I think that's an interesting aspect where, the national government, in this case, Colombia, in many ways has to act as peacekeepers, not necessarily as a side in the battle in and of itself.
I would certainly agree. And I think that the dynamic at play here so it's a combination of a couple of things we've already talked about in this other dynamic, right? So there's the carrot and stick approach that we described earlier with El Salvador, where the Colombian government has the option to either act as a negotiator to prevent violence between rival factions of either the ELN or the FARC, which I think it's important to note both of those organizations have splintered into quite a few different groups. The ELN is a lot more cohesive or has less splinters than the FARC, but there's still quite a few of them, right? So you're negotiating between these rival elements of both of these groups. And then the stick obviously would be military operations. Now, with military operations, you're going to see potentially in the short term a temporary escalation of violence because you're engaging them directly with the military. But the idea is that that's going to lead to a longer holding peace by either forcing the cartels or gangs or militias in this case to come to terms with one another or cease their attacks on civilians, or will lead to their dissolution, right? Whereas and in doing so, the government gains legitimacy if the operations go well, because individuals watch this and they say, oh, hey, well, the government came in, they solved the issue, and we don't have to worry about the ELN for a little bit now. Now, when using the carrot approach and negotiating between the factions, you may, in the short term to medium term, have longer and quicker lasting peace if those ceasefires are upheld. However, the government is also semi-sacrificing legitimacy because it's having to negotiate with a non-state actor, somebody who is clearly operating outside of the law, who is not abiding by any tenets of the law, and in most cases, as Stefano pointed out, is engaging in the trafficking of illicit goods.
I think the conversations that we're having about South America and the specific segment of the Cartel Corner highlights the complex nature of gang violence, organized crime, and how they're challenging kind of these state authorities. And in many ways, as we talked about specifically in Haiti, directly leads to state failure, both from a security standpoint, but also a political standpoint, right? Where, as you rightly mentioned, Haiti has not had a functioning government for a while now, and we're really no step further from trying to achieve that. Even with a massive amount of diplomatic pressure from the international community to try to at least resolve the political crisis, we haven't really seen that come to fruition. And I think that's a very important aspect when we're analyzing this, and that's why we have this cartel corner, because when we're talking about the dynamic of national security and foreign policy, people always jump to foreign terrorist organizations and the threats, or even insurgents groups and the threats that they provide. But crimes, organized crime, gangs, and cartels basically get completely overlooked.
Well,
Yeah,
I
for
think I
go
think that's
ahead.
interesting too, because if we look at the way a lot of this is still portrayed in the media, you can see bylines talking about a war against left-wing guerrillas, and they'll mention that, the drug trade helps them fund these organizations, but really, I think we need to look at these more as transnational organized crime at this point. It's not the sort of smuggling that you saw in the 70s and the 80s. They've become much more advanced. They've seen the money that comes in. And when you have the peace deal signed in 2016, the remnants of the FARC, like one of the ones that is involved in the current violence, Frente 33, they turn to drug dealing. They turn to making money. It's not this ideological drive by and large that kept these people operating. Um, and we're seeing this too when we look at most recently 9.5 tons of narcotics, presumably cocaine, were seized by authorities in the Dominican Republic. That was on a ship traveling from Guatemala and was bound for Belgium. So they have expanded their network. They have more operational control over this. And the rumors here are that it's actually that shipment that had originated in Colombia, most likely in Catatumbo, which is the area where we're seeing the violence right now. And the loss of that shipment might have played a role in Austin. Or Stefano, if you guys know more about this, but it does seem like local reports are pointing to the loss of this 9.5 tons of narcotics as one of the reasons why this ceasefire between the factions of the FARC and the ELN sort of disintegrated recently. So do you know if there's any truth behind that? And then we can also speak more broadly about how these organizations are evolving.
Yeah, so in regards to directly pointing to that shipment, I don't have any direct evidence that that's the case. That being said, that's a distinct possibility, as we have seen groups trying to ship narcotics in larger quantities with the hope that, if we just get this one shipment through Coast Guards or border protections or whatever, we are kind of secure in our funding for the next 5, 6 months, right? So I could see that being a possibility. The problem with I trying to attribute individual smuggling efforts to a specific group is that it's unlikely you're going to hear from the smugglers themselves, unless in very rare cases you can kind of attribute it based on location. That being said, if that is the case, that would provide pressure on those organizations to take more drastic measures in the short term.
Well, and to that point, I think it's interesting because the intelligence report that was put out by an independent organization and the local reporting doesn't point to who lost the drugs or who was responsible for transporting them. Just that the organizations and the chatter and the research that they had conducted pointed to that being one of the major breaking points of the ceasefire. But to
Yeah,
your
But I think
point, we don't necessarily have all the information there.
yeah.
But I think to highlight something you said, Matthew. I mean, there's a great account on X, formerly known as Twitter, called World Crime Intel, and he kind of tracks anything related to gangs, mafias, organized crimes, cartels, and drug seizures, right? And it was interesting towards the end of 2024. The common word by so many countries that were reporting kind of drug seizures for the entirety of 2024, multiple countries were reporting record drug seizures, record drug seizures, record drug seizures across the board, in not only in Latin America but in Europe as well, right? And it kind of indicates something that you mentioned, is that 2024 was an increase of probably drug production and consumption,
Mhm.
but also of drug seizure, because that was a common theme. And recently, as you said, the French Navy seized 9 tons of cocaine in the Caribbean Seas. I mean, that's a massive seizure in a naval operations around the Caribbean Sea, and it kind of indicates, this kind of this international drug trading organization. Because when you're looking at South America, we've talked a lot about kind of all these organic and national groups, but a lot of international organizations also base their operations in South America, right? You can't talk about, for example, Ecuador without including the Albanian mafia. You just can't. I mean, the Albanian mafia is well known and well documented to be in Ecuador, the Russian mafia, Chinese, etc. I mean, there's the international dynamic of all these different organized crimes leveraged and depend on South America, because that's where the drugs are produced and then from there shipped, either by illicit groups or in many cases actual either corrupt government officials, just as the former president of Honduras was indicted and imprisoned and convicted in the United States, or Venezuela, which is a narco state. And you can even look at a region, Matthew, that you're more familiar with in West Africa, for example, Guinea-Bissau, which for all intents and purposes is a narco state. And so you have this interesting dynamic of illicit organizations, non-state actors, corrupt government officials, and even narco states involved in the drug trade for a multitude of reasons. And we haven't even touched upon really the human smuggling aspect, not only to the United States, but also to Europe, and how all these organizations are involved to enrich themselves for their own greedy purposes.
Yeah, this is all tied in with globalization, and it's happening with organized crime as well. I won't go as far as to say the world is flat, but there's a reason that countries like the United States are interested in keeping groups that currently are landlocked within the Sahel from gaining access to the Gulf of Guinea. And so these interests, they're all intertwined, and that's why I really appreciate these conversations.
I would also say, as kind of a sticking point, is I think as we're getting into the space of defining some of these groups, or the American government is starting to define some of these groups as foreign terrorist organizations, kind of describing the nuances and the differences between what traditionally has been described or defined as an FTO versus what is now being defined. And one of those major differences, I think, does relate to these recent seizures. Because if you look historically, a major difference between political groups or political armed groups or terrorist organizations or militias or whatever, and transnational criminal groups has been terror groups in the past have been willing to message about and discuss their losses, when a terror group loses a certain contingent or a group of people, those individuals are generally messaged about as sort of martyrs for their respective political cause. Whereas when individuals from a transnational trafficking group are caught or convicted or killed or whatever, you don't really see a lot of internal or external messaging about it because it's seen as a position of weakness to admit that there was a loss there, either in monetary value of individuals, of arms, so on and so forth.
And they're also more open about, or they at least try to be open about their messaging and what they're trying to achieve. Uh, these organizations aren't exactly coming out and saying, we want to make as much money as possible. So
For
it,
sure.
and that's where the definition of terrorism versus organized crime versus bandits, it all becomes very, very muddled. Throw rebels on top of there to add another level of complexity. But I do think by labeling them foreign terrorist organizations, um, they're trying to use this as a tool, but I don't think that's necessarily in many cases an accurate description of some of these organizations. And we'll have to see what happens because it does create a very difficult position for security forces in the United States because intervening in foreign countries, sovereign countries, could be seen as something akin to an act of war. And it's not going to make us many friends. And on top of that, now we have this idea of potentially massive tariffs. We've got deportations. I think we are going to be stretching the resources of some of our neighbors very thin. And it's just going to make for difficulties with trade, seizing assets. And I wonder if maybe we're biting off a little bit more than we can chew, especially right off the bat like this. But we'll have to see, I guess.
We're definitely adding complexity to a multitude of issues that are already very complex themselves. But I'll reserve my further analysis until I see what this definition actually translates to. Does it translate to more support for police forces or law enforcement organizations in these countries? Does it mean active U.S. military involvement? I think once we start to see indicators towards what the solutions look like, will be when it'll be a good time to project on what does this mean for the criminal groups we're talking about.
I think we would all agree with that. So with that, that seems like a pretty good place to put a pin in it. Does anyone have any final thoughts?
No, Austin, I just want to say thank you again. This was a very great conversation. I think it was an excellent way to cover our second episode of the Cartel Corner. So I really appreciate for your depth of knowledge, your analysis, and your commentary, specifically on countries that don't necessarily receive the in-depth analysis that is required for our listeners. So I really appreciate
Well, thank you,
Thank you.
gentlemen, very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking to y'all.
Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to have you back, and I know that this is not your only area of focus, so doors always open. And with that, this has been the bottom line up front.